Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Elliot, and I'm the Communications Director here at C2ES. Heading into COP and COP24 in Poland, C2ES Executive Vice President Elliot Diringer today will share with us some insights on what to look forward to and some key issues surrounding these talks, as well as some input on what we've seen from our workshops with negotiators. Elliot has been engaged in the UN climate talks for more than 20 years, and he led the series of informal workshops I mentioned to bring senior negotiators from key countries together to examine these issues. Elliot also published a recent report on the takeaways from the workshops and our discussions with negotiators. The report, Essential Elements of the Paris Rulebook, can be found at the top of our homepage at c2es.org or at the link you should have received earlier in our media advisories. Along with his opening remarks, Elliot will also be referencing a PowerPoint presentation, which I emailed around this morning. If you did not see it or haven't received it, please email us now at press@c2es.org, and we'll send them to you right away. Following his remarks, we'll open up the call for questions, and just for awareness, we'll be recording this call, and we'll be placing it on our website. It will be available later today for any reference or review of quotes you may need. And with that, I'll turn things over to Elliot.
Great. Thanks, Alec, and thanks to all of you joining us. Good morning or good evening, depending on your locale. And for those of you joining us from the States, I hope you all had a relaxing Thanksgiving weekend. I will refer to the slides as I walk through them. So starting with slide 2, COP24 overview. I think it's fair to say that Katowice will be the most pivotal moment in the international climate effort since the Paris summit in 2015. There are two major outcomes expected at COP24. The first is the adoption of the so-called Paris Rulebook, culminating 3 years of negotiations over the operational details of the Paris Agreement on issues like transparency, accounting, compliance, and many others. The second major outcome expected is the conclusion of the Talanoa Dialogue. And this has been a year-long process reviewing collective progress toward the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And the outcome here is meant to inform the next round of nationally determined contributions that parties put forward in 2020. In addition to those two outcomes, a third major issue, one that really is a perennial issue at these COPs, is the issue of finance for developing countries. In that case, the issues under negotiation formally are actually quite limited, and it will be more about the signals being sent by donor countries about their intentions going forward. So with that overview, I'll turn to slide 3 and talk a bit about the context for the Katowice negotiations. And I think it's helpful to reflect back to the context at the time Paris was negotiated. This was a time when there was growing recognition across the world of the risks and opportunities presented by climate change. We saw a remarkably high degree of high-level political alignment led by a strong partnership of the United States and China, which brought other countries along. And we also saw growing action by the so-called non-state actors, states, cities, companies, and others. Fast forward 3 years to now, certainly there have been developments underscoring the risks presented by climate change. We have the very recent report from the IPCC on the implications of 1.5 degrees of warming. Later this week, we'll have a new report from UNEP highlighting the gap between the emissions trajectory needed and the trajectory we're on. So these reports are underlining both the urgency and the inadequacy of climate action. We also continue to have a string of climate-related disasters underscoring the here and now impacts of climate change and the growing costs of inaction. At the ground level, we do continue to see significant momentum among states, cities, and companies that are stepping up with investments and policies and other actions to strengthen climate efforts. Yet, when you look at the high level, at the leader level, we don't see the kind of strong attention that we saw running up to Paris. In many countries, political attention is being diverted elsewhere to issues like trade, immigration, nationalism, and competing priorities like, for instance, the Brexit issue in the UK. In that context, the negotiation of the Paris Rulebook poses some challenges of its own, both political and technical. This is really where the rubber meets the road on the Paris Agreement, translating the high-level provisions of Paris into nuts and bolts operational details. Moving to slide 4, I thought it might be useful to take just a minute to remind everyone of the basic structure of the Paris Agreement. We often describe it as a hybrid agreement, blending top-down and bottom-up elements designed to both achieve broad participation and to promote rising ambition. The fundamental bottom-up feature of Paris is the nationally determined nature of countries' individual contributions, their NDCs, which does encourage participation by allowing each country to tailor its commitment to its own circumstances. Alongside that, you have a number of top-down features of the agreement, its long-term goals on mitigation, adaptation, and finance, a set of common binding procedural commitments, for instance, the commitment to maintain successive NDCs, to pursue domestic efforts in line with those NDCs, and to report periodically on emissions and implementation. And then finally, you have a set of ongoing reviews, both of individual parties' implementation and achievement of their NDCs, and of collective progress toward the agreement's long-term goals. So you have a set of commitments and processes intended to encourage growing ambition over time. Moving to slide 5, ambition. When people talk about ambition in the context of COP24, they are generally referring to the Talanoa Dialogue. And this is the first of the global stocktakes that will take place every 5 years as a way of assessing collective progress. This time, in the first round, the dialogue is focused only on mitigation. The later stocktakes will also look at adaptation and finance. And again, this is meant to inform the next round of NDCs that countries will put forward in 2020. The Talanoa Dialogue has been conducted by Fiji as the president of COP23. And the outcomes that are expected are first simply a report summarizing the discussions that have taken place over the year. This will be prepared by Fiji, possibly in partnership with Poland, the president of COP24. And second, there will be some form of decision by the COP accepting this report from the Talanoa Dialogue and offering a perspective looking forward. This might be a standalone decision, or it could be incorporated into an umbrella decision for the COP. So the key issues to look for in the context of that decision is how it will address the Talanoa report. Will it simply accept it or acknowledge it, or will it use it as a basis for expressing concern about the lack of ambition we're seeing? Also, how the decision will reflect the findings of the new IPCC report. Again, will it simply welcome the report, or will it express deep concern about the findings of the report? And third, and perhaps most significantly, how the decision will address the earlier commitment parties made in Paris to revisit their NDCs by 2020. One option is for the decision in Katowice to simply recall that prior commitment, or the decision could go further and actively encourage parties to begin the domestic processes that would be necessary to come forward with more ambitious NDCs in 2020. There are many possible variations between those two, but I think that the thing to watch for is just how the decision speaks to those issues. And this is largely a political decision. It will be a very short decision, but one that will get a lot of focus. Turning to slide 6, the Paris Rulebook. This is where most of the negotiating will take place. There are literally dozens of issues spread across multiple negotiating bodies. This will consume all of week 1 and likely extend into week 2. Rulebook is not a formal term. This is a shorthand that applies to a mix of rules and guidance and modalities and procedures, and effectively these will more clearly delineate not just the operational details, but parties' expectations of one another and the processes they will engage in to implement the Paris Agreement. This is really where they decide the nuts and bolts of the Paris architecture. I won't go through all the issues, but just to give you a flavor, the issues include the kinds of information that parties must provide at various stages. When they initially submit their NDCs, for instance, they're supposed to provide information to ensure that they are clear, transparent, and understandable. And then later on, they will, every 2 years, have to submit information on their emissions and on their progress in implementing and achieving their NDCs. The rulebook will also address the review processes that parties will undergo, 2 layers of review, expert review and peer review. It will speak to the role of the Implementation and Compliance Committee that the agreement established. It will talk about how the global stocktake will be conducted, and it also speaks to how parties communicate on the issues of adaptation and finance. There are some cross-cutting challenges faced in developing these rules. How to develop a common set of rules for all countries that accommodates the very diverse types of NDCs that they have come forward with. Some have absolute economy-wide targets, some have intensity-based targets, some have BAU targets. They're all quite different. How do the rules speak to them all? And secondly, how do the rules balance, like the agreement itself does, national discretion on the one hand and international direction on the other? There is a particular issue in the context of transparency that gets lots of attention. The Paris Agreement, rather than providing for a strictly bifurcated transparency system like we have now, with different rules for developed and developing countries, anticipates a common transparency system, but does allow for flexibility for those developing countries that need it in light of their capacities. So one of the central issues in Katowice is how to operationalize that flexibility within the transparency system. Turning to slide 7, finance. As I noted earlier, the issues formally on the table are quite narrow. Within the context of the Paris Rulebook, you have 2 issues. One is the kind of information that donor countries provide ex ante. That means looking forward. There is a commitment to provide indicative information about future flows, and that's Article 9.5. And then there's Article 9.7, what the type of information donor countries will be providing on resources already provided or mobilized. There's been significant debate about the first of those, Article 9.5, attempts to firm up the commitments there and actually establish a more formal process to review the information developed countries bring forward, but they have strongly resisted that. Another potential issue that surfaced at the Bangkok talks in September is whether in Katowice parties will have anything more to say about the commitment made in Paris to extend or increase the collective mobilization goal. Right now, there is a promise by developed countries to provide or mobilize $100 billion a year by 2025. Or by 2020 through 2025, and in Paris there was an agreement to set a new goal beyond $100 billion a year by 2025. Some developing countries are pushing in Bangkok to formally initiate a process to set that goal, and that issue may resurface again at the COP. But the broader concerns that come into these negotiations about the predictability of future finance really extend well beyond the formal agenda. And it will be important to see what kind of signals are sent by developed countries on further progress toward meeting the $100 billion goal and on their intentions when the replenishment round for the Green Climate Fund opens next year. So I think those may, frankly, be more critical in terms of perceptions of the outcome on finance than on the formal issues. Turning to slide 8, as Alec mentioned, C2ES organized a series of in-depth workshops among senior negotiators from countries in all of the major negotiating groups. We held a dozen workshops over the last 3 years, including 6 just this year, and focused on most of the principal issues in the rulebook. This was a continuation of the role we played pre-Paris, and I would say, as in that case, these conversations were very candid and constructive and very solutions-focused. In fact, some of the issues that seem to dominate the negotiations in the formal setting barely surfaced in our informal discussions. I'll highlight just a couple of the suggested outcomes in the report that C2ES published informed by those discussions. One way to finesse the issue of diverse NDC types, for instance, on the information that parties provide with their NDCs and later on their progress, the decisions should specify the types of information to be provided, but leave it to each party to decide how that guidance is applicable to its own NDC type. A major issue focuses on emissions inventories. Here the suggestion is that all parties follow the latest guidance from the IPCC from 2006, but that the rules should allow some flexibility for developing countries that need it on specified aspects of that. I'm happy to answer questions on other issues addressed in the report, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead to slide 9, offer some flavor of the kind of positioning we see from some of the key countries and groups. Don't mean this at all to be comprehensive. With 190 countries and at this point probably dozens of different negotiating groups, I'm really just highlighting a few here. There remains strong interest in the role of the United States. The U.S. team continues to actively negotiate on the Paris Rulebook, despite the announced intention to withdraw from the agreement. And this is according to the administration's statement back in August of 2017. This is with an interest to protect U.S. interests and ensure all future policy options remain open. The U.S., in fact, continues to push very hard on transparency issues, taking positions quite consistent with those under the previous administration, but negotiating at this point from a weakened position. You probably will have heard that the U.S. is planning a side event as it did last year. I think that the side event will focus not just on coal, but also on nuclear energy and on natural gas. I'm sometimes surprised by the outsized attention generated by these events. I think the attention by NGOs and the press magnifies this event well beyond its real significance. It is literally one of hundreds of side events taking place at the COP and has little bearing at all on the actual negotiations. China also a major interest as the world's leading emitter right now. It remains a hardliner in the room on issues like continued bifurcation of developed and developing country responsibilities, continues to make the case on finance for developing countries, but its real concern is the degree of international scrutiny that it would have to face under a new transparency system. I think that in the end, China does not want to be seen as blocking or contributing to a failure. It felt very stung when it was characterized that way back at the Copenhagen conference, and I think in the end they will play a key role in helping to engineer compromises. The European Union, traditionally a strong leader on these issues, continues to push for strong rules, but doesn't have the kind of champions it once had, like Angela Merkel of Germany, who at this point is quite hampered by domestic politics, including politics around the future of coal. A new force within the negotiations is the Climate Vulnerable Forum. This is a group of about 50 countries led by the Marshall Islands that is really leading the case for stronger ambition. And then also the Africa group, which is leading the case on finance for developing countries for both mitigation and adaptation. So turning to slide 10 to sum up, I think we face three fundamental sets of challenges here. First, there are the inherent political and technical challenges of translating the broad strokes of the Paris Agreement into nuts and bolts operational details. Second, there are significant procedural challenges in wrestling dozens of issues across multiple negotiating bodies with a COP presidency that is still working to gain the trust of parties and sometimes seems more focused on domestic political imperatives than the needs of the negotiations. And then third, as I mentioned earlier, a significant challenge is that many national governments are distracted by other issues in these turbulent times. I would say, though, that despite these challenges, governments feel a collective political pressure to deliver. And I think for that reason, agreement on the rulebook is more likely than not. Governments know that a failure in Katowice will be seen as the unraveling of the Paris Agreement and as another blow to multilateralism, and that's something most would like to avoid. That said, I think it's important to bear in mind what this process can and cannot deliver. I think the Paris Agreement itself is a recognition of both the potential and the limitations of the multilateral process on an issue like climate change. It can encourage and facilitate action through a form of institutionalized peer pressure, but ultimately this is about domestic drivers and action. I think success in Katowice will be a mix of formal outcomes and signals from governments about their intentions on ambition and on finance. But our ultimate success, again, is a function of political will and decisions back at home. A final word on the issue of ambition. As I said, many who are concerned about ambition focus primarily on the Talanoa Dialogue, and I think the connection to the rulebook is often overlooked. The rulebook, in fact, is about much more than just rules. It is ultimately about accountability and ambition. The more confident countries are that others are contributing their fair share, the more willing they are to do more. In fact, I think the resistance we see from China and others to strong rules is testament to the power of transparency to really push countries toward higher ambition. So the signals that countries send about ambition in 2020 are important, but a strong transparency system is much more critical to building ambition over the long haul. In short, I think Katowice is an opportunity to truly embed the Paris Agreement as a durable, functioning framework that over time helps deliver the ambition we need to avert the worst consequences of climate change. Thank you, and look forward to your questions.
Our first question comes from Jeffrey Lynn, independent journalist.
Hi, Elliot. You mentioned all the various countries. You didn't mention Brazil. And I was wondering what effect you felt the Bolsonaro election might have on the conference and on the climate effort generally.
That's a good question, and one that's hard to answer. The new government, as you know, is not seated. I have heard that there may be representatives of the transition team in Katowice. Brazil often takes very strong positions on certain issues, and the situation is complicated by the fact that Brazil has actually put forward an offer to host next year's COP, COP25. So my understanding is that the incoming president has actually backed away from earlier statements suggesting that he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. But I think it remains to be seen what kind of negotiating instructions the team comes to Katowice with in terms of whether they will show greater flexibility than they have up to this point on issues like markets and inventories, whether they would hope to see all of the issues on the rulebook resolved in Katowice, and whether they will continue actually to offer to host the COP next year in Brazil.
Hey, it's potentially more serious than the United States position, isn't it? I think if Brazil were to go.
Well, I'm not quite sure how to rank the significance of potential withdrawals, and frankly would rather not speculate on the significance of a withdrawal that at this point doesn't really seem to be likely. I would just note that the United States does remain the largest economy in the world, and its actions on climate change do tend to ripple globally, whether that is in the form of action or inaction.
Our next question comes from Felix von Geyer of New Orator.
Hello. Elliot, great to hear you again. Now, I'm just thinking, because I've got two maggots in my brain at the moment. One is the importance to actually have the kind of the global carbon stocktake, that budget. And I was interested that the 1.5 degree report basically upped it from the original AR5, a 66% chance we're probably looking at 420 gigatons of emissions, as opposed to like 120 from 2018, which would be about 3 years worth. And I'm just kind of, okay, I'm in Montreal, so I work out that for Canada, if it's going to like keep its 1.6% share of that kind of budget, then it's got like 9 years basically at its current emissions level before it's not got an entitlement to produce any more emissions and keep within 1.5 degrees. And obviously we have the developing countries that still have to be developed. So the other maggot I have in my brain is that really the best thing would be for the United States to actually realize that launching and rolling out a global carbon market and having everybody trade it in US dollars would probably be the way forward and would get the transparency that's needed out of China and elsewhere. So I'm just wondering what your general comments are on those two issues. But then the final thing I really want to say is that I think ultimately we're going to be following like pretty much the logic of the Kyoto Protocol and the Clean Development Mechanism to come to a solution, just going to be in another form.
So let me try to take those in turn. With respect to the carbon budget, certainly this is critical information that is informing the decision-making that will take place in Katowice. The agreement, the Paris Agreement, is not built around carbon budgets. It doesn't provide for any sort of mechanism to tightly modulate parties' commitments on the basis of calculations of carbon budgets. Rather, it's intended to provide a means of feeding that information into the collective stocktake and then into parties' individual decision-making on their future ambition on the basis of what science is telling us. Second, on the question of the U.S. and carbon markets, a number of states, as you probably know, California and the northeastern states, are already actively engaged in carbon markets, in cap-and-trade systems. In fact, California is linked internationally to provinces in Canada. So there is growing momentum toward the use of carbon markets in the United States. That said, I would not anticipate enactment in Washington of any kind of economy-wide program for some time. And to the degree that carbon pricing is debated in Washington, the focus these days is more on the possibility of a carbon tax than a market-based approach. We have seen carbon tax bills introduced in this current Congress and expect we will be seeing more in the coming Congress. But again, we would not expect to see enactment of any form of carbon pricing at the national level for some time. With respect to any type of Kyoto-like CDM mechanism, I think we are dealing with a very, very different system than we did under Kyoto. In the Kyoto system, those countries that had commitments, they were all of the same type, absolute economy-wide emissions targets, which enabled a certain type of trading system. The Paris Agreement does provide for the use of market mechanisms, but given the very heterogeneous nature of countries' individual commitments, that will be a very different type of system. It does provide for the creation of a mechanism that could indeed look something like the clean development mechanism, but that's actually one of the issues that might likely be continued past Katowice. There may be some very high-level principles agreed there, but I would expect negotiations to continue on the actual shape of that mechanism.
Thank you.
As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please press the star key followed by the 1 key. That was star 1. Our next question comes from Ivan Koren with AFP.
Good morning. Can you talk about the issues where the U.S. is isolated, if any, in the discussions around the rulebook, and the issues where it has allies, and if so, who are they?
So I would say that by and large there actually is very strong alignment among developed countries on most of the rulebook issues. Some put greater emphasis on particular issues as opposed to others. But I would say among the developed countries, the U.S. is hardly isolated on those issues. It is paying particular attention to the issue of emissions inventories. It really has been leading the charge for rules that would require all countries to use the latest IPCC guidelines, the 2006 guidelines. It maintains that those guidelines actually provide all of the flexibility that any country would need to produce its emissions inventory. It faces very strong resistance from some developing countries on that issue, and the report that we produced based on our informal discussions does suggest that there be some limited carve-out from the 2006 guidelines to provide additional flexibility to those developing countries that need it. So I think that while there certainly are areas like inventories and finance where you will see differences, in some cases significant differences, between the U.S. position and the position of some developing countries, I don't think on the whole I would identify the U.S. as particularly isolated in these rule book negotiations. I would also just want to underscore that developing countries are not truly negotiating as a single block in these negotiations. It's a very large group of countries with a very broad range of interests, and you have many subgroups within that block. You have the small island states, AOSIS, you have the least developed countries, you have the like-minded countries. So while there is a bloc that includes China and India that has continued to take a hard line on some of the traditional issues, like bifurcation between developed and developing countries, many of those smaller groupings actually favor strong common rules and are really pushing, as I mentioned in the case of the vulnerable forum, pushing hard for stronger ambition.
And if I may follow up, how does the perspective that the U.S. may not update or revise its NDC in 2020, how does that influence the U.S. position, the U.S. negotiating team's position in discussing the rule book?
I think the announced intention of the U.S. to withdraw from the Paris Agreement can help but weaken its position in these negotiations. The team that represents the United States is made up of career diplomats who have negotiated these issues for many years and have earned considerable credibility and trust among their colleagues from other countries. So the U.S. is treated quite respectfully in the negotiations, and many countries welcome the positions that it puts forward. But it really isn't in as strong a position to carry those positions forward as it was in the past.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Don Reeves of Inside EPA.
Hi. Thanks, Elliot. Thanks for doing this call. To kind of piggyback onto the last question with the lack of U.S. leadership here and the signals the current administration is sending, can you discuss the impact on kind of the broader negotiations, even behind the scenes, and just the overall momentum that is felt by the parties? And also, given that, the U.S. stepping back and some of the other, what you had mentioned about Merkel in Germany and what's going on in Brazil, is there emerging a new leader of this movement, any country or bloc of countries that you could reference?
I think in the long term, continued by the United States invariably have a corrosive effect on global ambition. I think that's something we'll only see in time. As countries implement their initial NDCs and come forward with their new NDCs. Those will be the most important measures of ambition. I think for the time being, parties have sort of come to terms with the possibility that the United States may withdraw from the agreement. I think they are sensitive to the issues that the U.S. raises because they too would like to retain the option of the U.S. continuing to participate in the agreement. But I do think that the lack of high-level leadership we are seeing extends well beyond the United States. As I mentioned earlier, many governments are distracted or weakened by a set of other issues that have come to the fore. And given that, we actually are seeing a paucity of leadership at the highest levels.
Our next question And our final question comes from David Fagarty of the Straits Times.
Hi, Elliot. Thanks so much for doing the call. I have two questions. One relates on the effectiveness of the UN climate talks process, and the second relates to compromise particularly between the US and China on transparency and reporting. So I guess the first question is the IPCC 1.5 degree report is kind of a landmark. It doesn't break ground in the sense that it doesn't tell us anything that the science hasn't already told us, but it's spelled out much more clearly the threats from warming from 1.5 to 2 degrees in particular. So, and it's made particularly clear that the 1.5 degrees could be reached by 2030, even at the earliest, and well beyond that, much faster, I think, than most of us realize. And we've certainly seen a lot of the impacts particularly from wildfires in California, storms in Asia and elsewhere. So I guess my first question is about the effectiveness and the speed of the UN climate talks negotiations that don't seem to be happening fast enough really to meet the needs of addressing the pace of climate change. So in other words, climate change is happening faster than the UN climate negotiations. So how much is that really sort of facing negotiators, and do they really realize that? The second question is, of course, in September in Bangkok, when we were there was a very clear difference of opinion between the US and China in terms of transparency and reporting. I think it was relatively polite to a point. Is there going to be compromise between those two, particularly given the current state of disagreement on trade, the South China Sea and other issues? Are they really going to square off in Katowice, for example?
So on your first question, I think we've seen a real recalibration of expectations about the multilateral process over the last 20 years, and the Paris Agreement reflects the lessons learned. I think we just have to appreciate that we can't look to the multilateral process to really deliver the action that's needed. It can play a very important facilitating role, but the decisions that need to be taken are at the national level. And the multilateral process can influence those. It can help to cajole countries. It can provide a platform for a collective reckoning based on the latest science. But the process cannot really compel countries to take stronger action. So I think when we talk about the pace of action, we have to be careful not to attribute that entirely to the multilateral process. I think that's putting too much on it. That's more than than the process, frankly, can bear. And I think that those misplaced expectations can divert our attention from where the decisions really need to be made. I think the process can help by forcing countries to come together each year to face one another and offer an honest accounting of what they're doing, and then every 5 years say what they're going to do next. So I just think we need to understand this as one dimension of the effort that must be mounted on, frankly, every front, both public and private. With respect to the U.S. and China, what we see in the negotiating room is often more theatrical and tactical than what's really being discussed behind the scenes. There have been extensive informal and bilateral discussions, not just between U.S. and China, but among other countries as well. And I think that What we saw in the informal discussions we organized suggested that some of the issues that play strongly in the room are likely just tactical and will fade away by the time agreements are reached in Katowice. At the time of Paris, I think climate really emerged as a bright spot in relations between the United States and China. Those relations have grown only more difficult since that time, and it's not clear that climate can really serve that role again this time. But I haven't seen any strong evidence that the larger challenges in U.S.-China relations are infiltrating into the climate discussions. Certainly they don't help, but I wouldn't expect that they would necessarily get in the way.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, we have no further questions in queue.
Okay, thank you. I think we do have one of our journalists who was on the call asked an additional follow-up question, but I think she got muted. I don't know if she's still on the line, if she can hit star one.
As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, press star one. We have a follow-up question from Don Reeves.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you as well about the release of the National Climate Assessment here on Friday and whether you think that's going to be an issue as part of the negotiations, if it has come up, if you expect it to come up, and what those findings, whether they're going to help or hurt the U.S. negotiators who are there.
I wouldn't be surprised if many of the NGOs and perhaps even some parties refer to the National Climate Assessment and draw a contrast between its findings and the policies of this administration. I wouldn't necessarily expect the U.S. delegation to speak to the report. I think it will, it will help bolster the narrative that this administration in its actions is continuing to ignore the growing evidence that climate change poses to the United States. But I think that will be largely in the background and won't really enter in any way directly into the negotiations.
Thank you very much.
All right. And at this time, we have no further questions in queue.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. As I mentioned, we have recorded the call and we'll be posting it on our website. I will circulate that with you later this afternoon or evening if you're in Europe or further east. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me at gerlacha@c2es.org or at press, PRESS, @c2es.org. Again, I'll mention the report that Elliot mentioned, Essential Elements of the Paris Rulebook, is at the c2es.org homepage. It's also in the media advisory we sent around today and yesterday. With that, thank you for joining us, and I hope you are recovering from your holiday weekend in the U.S.